everybody, Ben Woodruff here with another Falconry video. Today's video, we're going to be talking about feathers and what's legal, what's illegal, and what the big deal is about feathers. Before I jump in, if you haven't already, if you could please hit subscribe. It really does help me keep this channel up and going, and I very much appreciate it if you do. Feathers, when it comes to, now I'm in the United States, so I'm going to be saying this from the perspective of the legalities we have here in the United States. But what are feathers? That may sound like a dumb question, but actually think about it. When you think about the body coverings of all animals, keratin is a biochemical that most animals, their body, whether it's fur, hair, scales, feathers, keratin is the biochemical of choice. It's a very simple compound, and it's used to make everything from rhinoceros horns to fingernails to hair and feathers. But feathers themselves, believe it or not, you may not know this, are scales. They are a very specialized scale, in the same way that flower petals are a very specialized leaf. But you're still taking the basic groundwork, the building blocks of a leaf, and repurposing them into a flower petal. Same thing. But it goes even further. Scientists have identified with their genetic studies what it is, which switches, so to speak, you have to do to switch a scale to a feather, or a feather to just a regular old scale. They've done this through experimentation and understanding the genome of chickens, particularly silky chickens. And so we know, we can say there's chickens with feathers that go all the way down to the tips of their toes, and they've also made ugly, scaly chickens. Just understanding the genetics behind it is kind of interesting. So at the end of the day, all this hubbub, all this fuss is over just a structure that is chemically basically identical to your fingernails. Based off of laws, you could be locked up in jail for breaking a feather law. You could have to pay a $250,000 fine for breaking a feather law of some kind. And it's seems kind of ridiculous on the one hand, where it's we're chemically dealing with fingernails here. Really? What's the big deal? So here's kind of how it goes. There's birds of prey. You will always hear, oh, you can't have a feather from a bird of prey. You can't have a feather from an owl or a hawk or an eagle, unless you'll usually hear somebody say, unless you're a certain percentage Native American, and then you can. And then, maybe hear, oh, I hear a falconer can have a feather. So it's a lot more complicated than that, but the basics. In 1918, the United States set in a group of laws called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And the idea was, hey, you know what? We've got a lot of people that are killing birds. The idea the only good predator is a dead predator, or they're shooting birds of prey for their feathers. We don't want that. We realize predators actually matter. We want to protect them. So we're going to make a law by making treaties with other countries. That way, you can just put it in place. There's no vote on it, really, which is kind of interesting, questionable in the ethics there. But the idea was, hey, how do we make this law? We'll say, well, hey, you know what? We want to protect our birds, but our birds in our country might migrate to another country, or then another time of year, our birds migrate north to that country. You know what? What if we protect them here with our local laws, but in another country they're unprotected? People might be shooting them or poisoning them. And so by making these Migratory Bird Treaty Acts and continually inviting countries to, hey, join in on this, then it's hey, any bird that might cross boundaries, let's say they're protected, okay? And it's not, you can't have their feathers, it's that you can't harm them, and you can't have any part of them. You can't have a live bird, you can't have a dead bird, you can't have their feathers, you can't have their claws, you can't have anything. And that was ideas to kind of prevent poaching and needless killing of birds of prey. So the spirit of the laws was kind of very, very well intentioned. Now, but it's not a bird of prey law. There's around 1,100, I think, species on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act list. And of all those birds listed, it's not just birds of prey. A lot of them are not birds of prey. And the funny thing is, the public perception, as well as the regular wildlife officer perception, is incorrectly that birds of prey are protected, but all those other birds don't matter, And so here's the deal. If you have a feather from a red-tailed hawk, okay, well, technically, unless you have a permit that says otherwise, you cannot legally have that. It's the same thing with a robin. If you have a robin feather, or some other bird listed on the species, on the list, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act species list, it's no more illegal to have a robin feather than a red-tailed hawk feather, and vice versa. Same set of laws, okay? But there's no black market in robin feathers. There's not people killing robins for their feathers, so you don't see that being common knowledge. And it's kind of interesting. I one time was giving a wildlife program and I had a great horned owl out during the show. And during the show, it flapped. It was molting season. A feather came out and landed on the ground. A little kid ran up, picked it up. And before I could say anything, a wildlife officer who was watching the show went over to her and said, "Hey, you know what? Sorry, you can't have that. Let me give that back to Ben. But, if you ever found something on the ground like a robin or a magpie feather, that you can have." And I'm like, you had a well-intentioned wildlife officer who just instructed this girl that it's okay to break a law because he didn't know that specific part of the law. So that's kind of interesting. Now, there are caveats. There are clauses in there where if you have a permit, then you are allowed to have certain feathers. You will hear certain things like, and I have to pause too. So all the birds on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act list, equally protected, including eagles. But there is an additional set of laws called the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that gives them an extra level of protection. And there's also an eagle feather laws that have been put in place that are meant to say, hey, any federally recognized tribe is allowed to get a permit for free. They just apply for it, and then they're allowed to have eagle feathers. But the interesting thing about that is there's some tribes, we even have one in my state, that are legitimate tribes but are not registered. They're not federally recognized. You also have Native Americans who, they know they're Native American, but they don't have their history of their specifics of their tribe, and so they can't even apply. I am a member of this tribe. I would like a permit to have an eagle feather. Now, you could be Native American, full-blooded, and not be able to do that. Then you also have people say, well, hey, if it's based off of the concept of freedom of religion, what about other nationalities to which the eagle is sacred? And I believe, if I understand correctly, they have started to allow recognized Scottish chieftains in the United States to apply for a permit to have feathers that are part of that. But it's a very interesting thing because in the concept of freedom of religion, does any religion get preferential treatment? Yes, no, should they, shouldn't they? And should any preferential treatment be based off of how long the religion's been around? If so, why? Because a sincere devotee of a faith of some kind, what if it's only been around 50 years, 100 years, 10 years, 1,000, 10,000? Does it matter according to United States law? Should it? Shouldn't it? It's an interesting point to bring up. But what about you as a falconer? So state by state, there may be stricter laws. But the basic idea is if you have a falconry license, your bird, if you keep it for more than a year, is going to molt. And those feathers, it's going to molt out feathers, and there will be new feathers that will grow in. You can keep those molted feathers for the purpose of imping. That's the intention. Is it like, hey, it's not like, hey, I'm wearing it in my hat or I'm using it for decoration. And there's wiggle room and interpretation. And you could have a wildlife officer or a judge who might try to come down on you and say, hey, you are having your feathers in a cup on your mantle. That's using them for art and display. That's not the intention of the falconry law. And you're like, well, that's where I'm storing them. Why does it matter? And they could, hypothetically, give you a citation. So a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll save their feathers, they'll put them in big Ziploc baggies and freeze them so that, moths can't get to them. And the intention is if your bird breaks a feather, you can repair it with a previously molted feather in something called imping. Now, it's a little different when it comes to eagles. Eagle falconry in the United States, there's not a whole lot of people who do it, but it's increasing, which is great. And so here is the interesting thing, because I have trained at education eagles and kept education eagles where I had a separate permit to teach with a non-releasable eagle, and I have also had falconry eagles, both. And the laws are a bit different. If you have an education eagle, every feather it molts is supposed to be gathered up and sent yearly to the Eagle Feather Repository, the Federal Eagle Feather Repository, to give to Native Americans who apply to have them. And also, if your eagle dies, you're supposed to do that as well, which that's an interesting experience for people to go through. Now, on the other hand, if you have a falconry golden eagle, If it molts primary feathers, secondary feathers, and tail feathers, you are allowed to keep those for imping your golden eagle. But the other feathers, they request that you send them in. And it's written a little bit nebulous. The idea is like, please turn the other feathers that are not for imping into the eagle feather repository. You can keep the wing and tail feathers for imping, but again, if you don't use them, please send them in to us. So it's a little bit different. It is good always to be up to date on what the current laws are so you don't accidentally make some mistake that you are unknowingly doing. So all of these laws, again, were originally written with the intention that you can just, make sure that people aren't, hopefully, killing birds of prey needlessly. Now, if you are a falconer, a lot of states, as I understand, and it might even be in the current federal ruling, is that you're not supposed to keep feathers for a species you don't have. But I know in my state we pushed back on that because you can replace a feather from a species that's not the same. Maybe you don't have access to it. It's very common for me if I'm flying a goshawk or a Cooper's hawk and a tail feather breaks, I usually intentionally replace it with a Harris hawk tail feather because Harris hawk tail feathers are much more resilient, far less brittle, and can handle a very aggressive hunting bird. And so that's an intention. I had an apprentice that one time had a situation where his red-tailed hawk had gotten in an accident where the tail had just total thing had gotten shredded. We didn't have any red-tailed hawk tail feathers, and believe it or not, to finish off the season, we imped that tail with great horned owl tail feathers, and it worked. The bird was fine, hunted just fine. It was an interesting experience, but But be sure to be up to date on what the laws are in your area if the Migratory Bird Treaty Act applies. And again, you just don't want to be making a mistake accidentally. You also you got to remember, just because you can legally have feathers from your bird does not mean with your falconry permit that you can be like, hey, friend, here you go. Here's a feather from my bird as a souvenir. That's illegal. And you're technically then having them break a law. So you don't want to do that. But then the other interesting thing is, what if the species is not on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act list? For example, I'm in Utah. If I fly a Lanner falcon or a Eurasian eagle owl, the state of Utah requires me to still have a permit to keep, fly, and hunt with those birds, but they're not protected federally, and they're not protected internationally by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which means their feathers are not protected, okay? So, in theory, legally, I could give somebody a Lanner falcon feather, I could give somebody a Eurasian eagle owl feather and be like, here you go, and they're not breaking any law. But again, you have to be careful. You don't necessarily want to do something like that. Even if it's legal, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people who administer the law or enforce the law are aware of that minutia of detail. And so in court, you would be able to defend, hey, look, this species is not on the list, we're fine. But you could, in theory, have a wildlife officer give a citation to the friend you gave an eagle owl feather to. They're not breaking a law, but they'd have to go to court and go through all that hassle. So you have to be very careful. So err on the side of caution, know your laws, and it's just a very, very interesting subject. Again, all this fuss over what's chemically a bunch of fingernails. It's really, really strange, but know your laws, know your feathers, and you'll do well with that kind of knowledge. But I hope this is an interesting introduction, kind of a different subject than we normally go into, but it does apply to falconry. And again, wildlife education, every state is going to be very different in what it says about feather usage, so you have to contact your state to know. But federally, if it's on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act list, you're covered on your falconry permit, but keep those feathers to yourself. So, hope this video was useful. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know down below. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. And as always, happy hawking.